right, let's dive right into the matter. Andreas Kruse will be the first speaker. For more than 2 decades, he has been the head of the Institute of Gerontology of Heidelberg University in Germany. And this is a function that would have been sufficient to invite him today, but not enough. It doesn't stop there. Mr. Kruse was also a member of the Commission for the drafting of an international plan of action on aging by the United Nations. He's the chairperson of the Age Commission of the federal government, member of the German Ethics Council, and is the author of numerous books, 2 out of which look at the life of Bach. Because Mr. Kruse is a musician by background and education, so this is a presentation that you will not forget, I'm sure. Professor Kruse, The Art of the Fugue and Age and Aging, Art and Science Interwoven. Thank you very much. That was a very kind introduction. Thank you, Consul General, Mrs. Fang, Mr. Mark, Mr. Franz, I'm sorry, my apologies. However, we're all humans in the end, aren't we? It is a pleasure for me to be here today and to have an opportunity to speak to you, to share with you some thoughts, questions that we pose each other and that we wonder about ourselves when it comes to age and aging. As was said before, this is a symposium, of course, so against this background, I would like to also focus on aesthetics. So I will play for you later on in order to show that this component, that aesthetics are important regardless of the content for old people, for people who are dying, for people who are severely ill. It's important to not lose sight of that. In the process of aging, there are so many things you're able to describe, but when you look at Henri Bergson, the philosopher and writer, Time and Freedom in particular, it becomes clear that the human psyche is something like a flow, a river of experiences. He said, this river, if you will, is hard to describe with words in some cases, because when I set out to try to describe in words, in languages, what happens in this flow of experiences, I put my own psyche, my experiences, my feelings, my emotions into words, and something is lost along the way. So if people are suffering from dementia, this flow of experiences, this river is so important. The philosopher and psychiatrist Karl Jaspers called it to tune into. If you tune into this train of thought or flow that you will find with, for example, in people with a severe depression or melancholic state, it helps them, it stops this river of melancholy, and it helps to trigger so many things that matter to the individual, which can be hardly expressed in words. And against this background, I like the fact that people try to approach these phenomena via the arts, via the aesthetics. In the next 4 or 5 weeks, we will publish a book at my institute on old age, where we describe several studies carried out by the Institute of Gerontology at Heidelberg. Our aim was, amongst others, to have a headline that reads, "The moment is mine." And we borrowed that idea from a verse of Andreas Kruse, Baroque writer, who lived until 1664. And when he looked at time, he wrote, "I do not own the years. The years took away my time, and I do not own the years that might lie ahead. No, what is mine is the moment, the very moment, and if I'm mindful of it, I take it away from the years and from eternity. Ladies and gentlemen, the central idea is the older you grow, in particular if you reach old age, the closer you get to death. The moment is so precious, the moment that I can use, the moment that feels right to me, that I can fill with meaning. This moment becomes more and more vital. You know that a whole field of philosophy by Søren Kierkegaard follows this idea, Kierkegaard and his notion of eternity. The moment becomes ever more important to me. And this is also reflected in my work with senior citizens, with old people, people who are suffering from dementia. It's vital in this work. My work in that respect will only be successful if I am able to put my finger on this moment, a moment that has meaning for this person with dementia, to be able to express it and to fill it with something. And other speakers will take up this idea. But let me also say this moment that seems to me to make sense and to be filled with meaning. That moment happens within a certain context, my environment, my life. So around that moment, I'm able to build up a spectrum of activities, of experiences, to realize myself. Do I have the material resources that I need to be able to live inside a building or under a roof that helps me to reach that helps me to be open, to recognize that moment when it comes along? And this moment also has a meaning in terms of plasticity, because if I'm open for new things, if I'm open for new ideas, it activates neural networks, which helps neural plasticity, which helps the aging of the brain. And by the way, that is also essential for our reality. Allow me to share Johann Sebastian Bach with you for 2.5 minutes. I would like to start with Bach by way of introduction. I'm sure you're all familiar with this piece. It's a beautiful piece, and I believe this is an aesthetic approach to this moment that I mean. Enjoy.
Wenn wir uns in einem ersten Schritt
As a first step, if we look at the question of what does it mean
darüber nachzudenken,
to think about and to look for solutions with a view to age today and age tomorrow. If that's your starting point, I believe it does make sense to look at three elements and focus on something that the neurological and biological perspective, where they are reflected biomorphosis, genetics as potential, and plasticity. In Heidelberg at the university there, and there are numerous other colleagues at other institutes for gerontology, were always impressed by this construct of biomorphosis. Bios morphe, in Greek, bios is the lifespan, and morphine, to create, to shape. Biomorphosis means basically that we, the organism, that we need to look at the organism across the whole lifespan, from birth to death. And biomorphosis describes a continuous process, a process where structure is developed, organic structure, organs that change and develop, and functional changes in individual organs and organ systems. And if you look at the term biomorphosis and take it as a metaphor, if you take it seriously, if you take it literally, we're looking at a biological, genetic, and psychological perspective. You cannot really call it age and aging. You have to call it aging instead of age, because it's a continuous process, a continuous change. Why is that important? Well, because it immediately becomes visible then, if we assume that the human DNR and systems and cells do not forget. The DNA doesn't forget good and bad moments, blockages, and support any type of situation. It becomes obvious immediately that everything we invest at an early age, when it comes to education, when it comes to material and ideological wealth, early child education, etc., that all of that we invest is something that still can have an effect and reverberate at a later age. So it is hardly surprising that studies that were conducted as far back as 2 decades ago impressively showed certain things. For example, the number of school years, and we're not even looking at the quality of education, but the mere number of years you attend school first has an effect on the life expectancy of people, and secondly says something about the morbidity, the probability of morbidity of the individual. So education, if you just take this one factor, so any measures for disease prevention or health support, anything that we invest or that we do not invest in the individual development at an early age, that we take away from the individual, these factors influence life during the second half of your life and influence your old age, your aging. This biomorphosis, to pay attention to it and to be aware of the fact that when we decrease social inequalities, we also make a contribution to allowing more and more people to reach a higher age and to enjoy old age, shaping it in such a way they want. That is a major task for society as such and for social policy. However, this investment also shows that it is essential that we consider the whole lifespan and that we do not artificially start to talk about old age at some point, because age is not a point in time. Aging is a process. This is a continuous development, continuous change. Nature does not know any jumps, any saltos. If that is interrupted, if there is a discontinuation, whether cognitive or physical, then we're facing a problem. Genetics, we will hear from another speaker. To focus on genetics and see it as a potential seems an even bigger challenge to me and an even bigger opportunity. In the past, in development biology and physiology, in the books that describe that, you could read that there was a program, a biological program. We are programmed in such a way by our genes in a determining way. Genes determine, they have a power, deterministic even. Now we know that genetics harbor a major potential. This is a potential that needs to be nurtured. So, for example, diseases or disorders that will reach the core of a cell, the nucleus, we need to protect the cell from these diseases, and we need to maintain this potential for the longest time so that the cell is able to interact as long as possible with other cells. And if we look at the metabolism, for example, if we look at the world of work, and that's very important, if we achieve a situation where cognitively, physically, and socially, and also with a view to the overall personality of the individual, if we can help people and support people across the whole lifespan of the individual, we excite cells, cell clusters. And by exciting them, by triggering something, they connect. And with the help of that, we have robust neural networks. And these networks themselves, create a fascinating protection against neurodegenerative forms of dementia, for example. Even if that type of dementia can be observed, a robust, stable neuronal network will be harder to be penetrated in comparison to, or as opposed to, a network that has never been formed or that is weak. So we mustn't be surprised by the fact that the educational background of someone can increase the risk or can enhance prevention when it comes to neurodegeneration and has a protective factor for humans. So the potential, the biogenetic potential, and harboring it much more than we are already doing across the different ages, seems very important to us in our field of expertise. And if we are successful, we will achieve and be able to maintain plasticity, functional plasticity. The organs will be performing much longer. Structural plasticity, which means that cells, nerve cells, will be maintained. So why is it important to focus on these three, constructs or concepts, if you will, when we reflect about the age of today and age and aging tomorrow? Well, because on the basis of these notions, of these fields, we can say, if we live in a democratic society where every individual will be able to voice their demand and desires to have material wealth and immaterial wealth, or if there are people who do that in place of the individuum to help the individual, then at the end of the day, we will not only make a contribution to achieving a higher life expectancy, but a higher life expectancy with a better physical and socio-emotional competence. Ladies and gentlemen, it does not mean that I'm in favor of trying to turn all the 90-year-olds into 20-year-olds. No, it also means succumbing to the flow of age. At some point in time, it will become irreversible. However, the question is, at which level do you enter that age? And how do I shape and form my environment? How much power I have to do that? That I can influence by promoting, by supporting an individual person in an open society. And this is why, ladies and gentlemen, for us in gerontology, we do not only look at the biological slash medical and psychological perspective, we also look at sociology. Because that point of view is important, because we need to understand and implement the fact that development is always an interaction between the situation, the environment, and the individual. There's a space, there's law, there's the society, there's structure, and all of that, this environment has an influence on the human being. And we have to offer opportunities to those who are disadvantaged across their lifespan to be able to reach and fulfill their potential from the biology and psychology point of view. You can derive a social demand, but it's a benchmark for biomedicine and psychology, if you will. Now, this question of what is the notion of age today and what is the notion of age tomorrow, it's a question that we've been tossing around in gerontology for decades with a lot of commitment and power. We've been looking at this question for years. Paul Baltes, an age researcher, and Ursula Lehr, the age researchers, both of them said, maybe when we talk about aging, we tend to only describe the processes that happen in aging. So we take a step back and only observe. However, biology claims more, it demands more of us. It demands that we look at these processes without being too present, to help, to promote, to look at performance, potential performance. It's important across the whole school system, starting at preschool. But to translate competence into plasticity, and that we have a continuous stimulation and activation, that we use the organic basis to increase competency, and that is possible by way of intervention. And if you look at patients, for example, stroke patients or patients suffering from dementia, by the way, you can do that by continuously, systematically activate their rehabilitation. They do not go back to their old level of competency, but you're even able to increase it further. But to come back to what Mr. Grabowski said, powers are unleashed, life sciences, that's a cura posterior, a cure post-fact. What is important to me is that I offer people the opportunity, that I support the individual in achieving whatever they want to achieve. What I called the potential, the higher potential, the potential of old age. In psychology, that is my core discipline, in the field of psychology, we realize more and more that the very high age of a person unleashes unbelievable processes in the psyche of a person. Maybe they are special to very old age, but maybe they are also special to people, to quote Karl Jaspers again, that are special to people who are at a certain threshold or in a certain situation. And that brings me to my third point. People suffering from tumors, from severe neurodiseases or other disorders, losses, etc., people who are faced with that, they need support, because it is very taxing on their psyche. And this is another reason why we at the Heidelberg Institute, but other colleagues I'm sure do that as well, Cologne for example, this is why we look at old age from the point of view of vulnerability and potential. Vulnerability, what does that mean? Looking at capacities, reserves that are decreasing, organic functions, in particular your movements, cannot be controlled as well as before, can be controlled but not as well as before if you've reached the age of 80 or 90. And cognitive processes can not be controlled as well either. We're talking about executive function. So we observe us in thinking, in cognitive performance. This executive function decreases, and what we see is that the organism of the human being becomes unsolvable, becomes a riddle almost, because your organic capacity varies so much between individual persons. Someone who's 85 years of age or 90 years of age who will tell you, I feel full of power, and the same person will tell you a couple of days later, I have the impression that I'm restricted in my movements, my motor skills, and my performance has decreased so much. So within a couple of days, that will happen. You will hear that. In geriatrics, there is a leitmotif called frailty, which is very difficult to translate into German. And frailty consists of 5 components: your physical performance, your ability, the subjectively perceived ability to perform, the control of motor skills and physical functions, then the power of the hand, and the sarcopenia, which is losing weight because your muscle tissue decreases. So this is frailty. Some people reach it earlier, some people reach it later, but it describes vulnerability. And ladies and gentlemen, this brings me back to aesthetics. This vulnerability is something we have to deal with. We have to learn to deal with it. It's a social task. We need to create an environment where everyone is able to participate in society, where everyone has the opportunity to get help and support. It's a matter of culture. It's a matter of dealing with vulnerability in our culture. It's a very powerful thing, vulnerability. How do we talk about it? And then at the end, it's a question of what is your individual notion? What is your individual approach, your psyche? Are you ready to succumb to this experience? Are you ready to adapt and to familiarize yourself with this experience? Am I ready to do that? If you do not take that into account when you talk about age and aging, you haven't understood what it is. And taking that as the starting point, the vulnerability of people at a very high age. It can also happen at an early age if you've worked under conditions that were monotonous and physically taxing. You have people with a severe arthrosis or diabetes because their lifestyle was poor. Then in these people you see this vulnerability earlier. If you do not take that into account, gerontology becomes a fun science and you might say, oh, we can skip all that, let's move on. However, I am convinced, and that might be due to the fact that as of day one in gerontology, I looked into chronic diseases. I wrote my thesis about stroke patients. I was deeply affected by my research. For me, it has always been important to never lose sight of the fact that the psyche may react to the environment, to these factors. Among the German Research Society, there are wonderful colleagues from Essen and Münster universities with which we carried out projects looking at the following question: chronic diseases, metabolism, diabetes mellitus type 2, lifestyle associated diabetes, etc., whether these diseases are more probable to lead into a situation where you need care. If you, as an individual, as a patient, do not feel a certain coherence, you feel a loss of control, and you feel you do not have the techniques to cope with your illness. Studies confirmed that that is the case. Chronic disease, reaching a state where you require care, this development is influenced by your environment, by your lifestyle, by your psyche. And this is why we said we need to focus much more on the psyche of people when we look at aging, and in particular aging in the future with future cohorts, much more than we're doing that today.
I will give you a short piece of music that will actually hint to my next topics, and it's a little poem that I would like to give you for you to get tuned in. It was as if the sky had silently kissed Earth, and with all its blossoms, she dreamed of it. The air went through the fields, and the corn made some sound in the winds, and the stronger the night was. And now the second part of the poem. And my soul extended its wings, flew through the silent country as if it flew home.
Wenn wir uns also
Now, if we deal with the psychological processes in old age,
dann treten für uns auch vor dem Hintergrund
then,
der Analyse
especially when you want to analyze it in interviews with old people, 80 years, 95 years old, or 70 years old, then there are 4 psychological processes that become more important for us. So the reflection on these 4 psychological processes is also the aesthetic component of this event, and it might actually be fruitful for us today. The first is introversion and introspection. It means that older people describe very often situations, or they have a certain perspective that shows us that the psychological processes, so the processes of yourself, the center of our personality, these processes reach the center of our awareness, and these people deal with these psychological processes more intensely. And then what comes about is what the US Dr. Robert Butler once said, it's the life review. So you take a look back at your life. It's an introversion. And you more and more concentrate on your individual processes the older you get. So you have a life review. You deal with central experiences in your life, in your past life, if you will. We also speak of introspection. So you actually look at your life in retrospect. And all this happens in a sort of attitude that the Roman Latin philosopher Aeneas Seneca once described as tranquillitas animi, which is the tranquility of your soul. So that means your psyche needs to calm down and relax, if you will. And that's why it's so important that people, supported by medical staff, care staff, social workers, so that their soul can rest. So, for example, enough income, participation. A second process we call openness to new things. Of course, we experience that in all phases of life, but in our diction, it means open to questions of spirituality, a certain form of spirituality, which means to experience transcendence. I'm part of a whole, of a cosmos, if you will. There's something in my life that goes beyond my person, my personality, my physical existence. It's not free of empirics, of course. I myself did some studies on palliative care, and here I could see how important this transcendental spiritual dimension is when it comes to terminal care. The question whether I'm part of a holistic cosmos. And once you evaluate the findings of palliative care, then you see how many patients that they expect from the health and care staff, that they are open to the spiritual questions. However, and that's very important to me, openness also means the potential of old age. Openness means to be open to the life situation of other people from the perspective of old age towards people who are younger or at a very young stage in life. This potential is something that we do not tap because we don't use the possibilities of intergenerational exchange. If we were to use these possibilities of intergenerational exchange, then we would have the opportunity to experience that older people care or worry about younger people. They worry how young people can live their life in the future. Will it be in this world, against the backdrop of all these climate changes? Will they be able to do that? Aren't we also part of the reason that we have exploited natural resources? Isn't it our fault? Can we still enable the younger generation to live on this planet? We call this openness to the next generation, a generation which, a line of generations that you are part of it yourselves. And there are some artists who do really great projects where they bring together older and younger generations, and you can't imagine how open the older people are towards the younger generations if you often offer them a respectful form of exchange. And we believe that this openness to the younger generations might also be an expression of generations, or symbolic immortality, if you will. You want to have an immortal existence living in the younger generations, if you will. And in civil society, there have been some comparisons of civil society in different countries, and you can see that there's a huge initiative from older people when it comes to joining with the younger generation to climate protection. But there's always the prerequisite that you need to create an opportunity for these generations to meet. And the older generations want to experience the possibility to worry about younger generations. And this is part of expanding your knowledge, even in old age. But why did I talk about these four potentials, psychological potentials of old age? Well, because we are interested in the question how we can help people get through this borderline situation, introversion or openness, or worries and care and passing on knowledge. That could be a great basis for people to deal with borderline situation. And I think the aesthetic framework, listening to music, experiencing nature, talking about important life topics, that framework can help making people aware of these potentials and dealing with certain situations, borderline situations. And this brings me to a question that is very important and actually also marks the end of my presentation. It's the responsibility of older people and the construct of worry. Now, if you were to ask me what should age look like in future, then I would answer you, of course, in the population we will have social levels and social societies with an impressive number of digital devices and opportunities, with different households, no matter where in the world. So you can exchange and communicate with households all over the world digitally. And the use of digital technology will be easy for all generations. And that is something I welcome very much. You can see that in the first waves of the pandemic, that some nursing homes had digital equipment to enable the older generations to participate in social life and to communicate with others digitally. But I find it quite interesting to see that the older generations today say, well, I don't want to be digital, I also want to be analog in my way of communicating. Because the interpersonal, the interbodily experiences, if you will, or certain forms of emotional and intellectual tenderness in high age are more and more important in older age. The German Ethics Council in December of last year said that it can't be possible that it is forbidden to visit elder people in nursing homes. nursing homes have become high performance towers of forts preventing people to enter. That cannot be the last solution to how your hygiene standards and protective measures look like. And especially in old age, when it comes to socio-emotional exchanges, you have a small circle of people. Here you can experience personal, emotional, mental experiences, and that is so important in old age. And we must not forget about that. It is a huge threat if we were to stop these experiences and these contacts. What do I want to say with that? The aspect of worry, having older people worry about the younger generations, the aspect of exchange between younger and older generations, and the interest of younger people in older people, and vice versa. That is a very important prerequisite for the civil society and for working life, so that we can experience other cultural, social forms of old age and to maintain those. And that's why we will always say it cannot be enough to just ask ourselves whether I can have a place where you can meet elder people. It has to be an intergenerationally friendly place, and only then elder people, when they can maintain an exchange with younger people, whenever they have the feeling that they can pass something on to the younger generation, they have a much higher potential to overcome borderline situations if they have the opportunity of this exchange. Let me give you an example. In 2015, or since 2015, we have a refugee congress, and I am the sponsor of that. And here I asked, actually students of different disciplines asked me to be the sponsor for that. And I wanted to head this congress under the topic of enabling older generations to take care of younger generations who did not have a social home or could not build a social home here. About 600 people took place in this congress, many refugees, representatives of refugee associations, and many old people, 70 years and older. And this refugee congress led to the fact that certain twins or pairs came up. We called them twins because they wanted to bring across a life project. These were twinnings of older people and younger people, and they said that's wonderful if the older people said it's wonderful if we can care for the younger people. And I'm sorry, I can still talk a little bit because I started late, so I'm not actually over my time. Please bear with me. Don't get nervous. I'm almost done. Anyway, these twinnings we had a closer look at. And the younger people, teachers and family members said, it's quite interesting to do that together with older people. It's not competitive. It's emotionally near. It's supporting. And the older people said, and that's actually my last message here, what's quite impressive is that when you have the feeling or the impression that you can do something for the younger generations, that you have the opportunity to do so, then you don't feel that you cannot participate, that you're out of this world. You feel an important part of the world. And that makes it much easier for you to deal with the borderline situations of old age. So let me summarize. We understand the aging process as a continuous change of experiences, the continuity of your development, bodily development, mental development, in situations where we can feel or where we experience diseases, bodily and neurological ones. And secondly, we expect that such aspects such as plasticity or biology as a potential need to be focused on differently. Age cannot just be described or shouldn't be described, but we should try to place these developments and to make them fruitful in society. We do that against the backdrop of the fact that the social framework conditions for a good old age shouldn't be neglected at all. It's more important than ever. We should take a look at it from a potential perspective, where the psyche plays an important role, and we need to find forms of expression that the psyche can outlive its possibilities. And it's important to have people have the opportunity to worry about younger generations, which is a social and cultural task for us. Because only if they can do so, if they can worry about younger people, they will feel that they are part of the world and that their experience of being part of the world enables them to tackle and deal with difficult borderline situations. And then a 3.5 minute piece of music, and then the floor is yours.
Danke, Andreas Kruse.
Thank you, Andreas Kruse. I hope I did not promise too much. Andreas Kruse made these experiences for 30 years. And I myself have been a host or moderator for 30 years now, and I'm very close to the clock, if you will. So I always make sure that everybody sticks to their time